This video demonstrates features of the Envisioning History World War II database and the Palantir platform, focusing on portions of the Battle of the Atlantic. The Envisioning History database is best used for individual exploration, learning, and research. This video illustrates features available and the types of analysis you can do, but producing a brief video means that we can cover only small parts of a very big story. Other videos produced by Envisioning History cover different topics from World War II. They are all produced from one database. Direct access to the database is available on a limited, no-cost basis to scholars and educators interested in participating in development of the platform for university-level education and scholarly research. See details at the end of the video for more information. We'll focus mainly on two major transition periods in the Battle of the Atlantic. A post-war British Admiralty graph of the total tonnage lost calls the first period the invasion of U.S. coastal waters, the rapid increase in merchant ship sinkings following U.S. entry into the war. The second transition occurs in the first half of 1943 in the periods designated all-out offensive and loss of refuelers, where there is a rapid decline in merchant sinkings. We'll start with the map view and perform an area search for the events that occurred in the zone from Guyana to Panama and north to Nova Scotia. We'll restrict the search to the events occurring in the first half of 1942. This was the period before the U.S. widely adopted the use of convoys, so most of the attacks that occurred in this area were individual events. We see all the events that occurred, but we need to clean this up. Looking at the types of events in the histogram, we see many are designated as diplomatic or political, such as the First and Second Washington Conferences. We'll remove those from the map. Then we'll color events initiated by Germany in green to distinguish them from events initiated by the Allies or neutrals. Using a time filter to scroll through the events on the timeline, we can see the geospatial pattern as the U-boats sent against the U.S. East Coast grow in number and work their way south into the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico over this 6-month period. The bars on the timeline indicate the number and types of events shown on the map. By selecting all events on the map, the histogram shows us that only 4 U-boats were sunk in this area during this period. Zooming in and drilling down on the U-352 sinking, we can see that most of the crew was captured. Here's a photograph of the captured crew marching through a POW camp in North Carolina, as well as a declassified report of the crew's debriefings. Now let's compare 3 convoy battles. We'll put the major events for convoys SC-48, ON-166, and ONS-5 on the map and give them separate colors. The Battle of Convoy SC-48 occurred in November 1941, prior to the U.S. officially entering the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. U.S. ships and aircraft were already involved in Allied convoy protection prior to the Pearl Harbor attack, however. ON-166 occurred in February 1943. We see that 2 U-boats were sunk during this period, compared to the loss of 15 merchant ships. ONS-5 occurred in May 1943, with 7 U-boats sunk in this major Wolfpack attack. We also see that in the ONS-5 battle, 2 of the U-boats were sunk by land-based aircraft, the start of a major trend we'll look at in more detail. Moving to the graph view, we'll do a quick search for the 3 convoys and add them to the graph. SC-48, ON-166, and ONS-5. The data on ONS-5 shows it was called the Decisive Convoy Battle of the War by the CNO's Operations Evaluations Group at Columbia University, the U.S. Navy Center for ASW Operations Research. Note that source documents for every event or ship are listed with the event, and those documents are an integral part of the database. In addition to the specific reference, we can also see the full context of this key statement. Examining the opposing forces in these three battles by performing a search around, we see 12 escorts arrayed against 10 U-boats in SC-48, 7 escorts against 20 U-boats in ON-166, and 15 escorts against 3 wolf packs on ONS-5. Expanding those wolf packs, we see 43 U-boats engaged against the escorts and 42 merchant ships. We can also see from the data that of the 43 U-boats sent against ONS-5, only 2 survived to the end of the war. Next, we look at all the U-boats sunk or lost during the war. Adding them to the map, we see the geotemporal distribution of these sinkings. Because there are almost 800, it's easier to look at a heat map showing event density. Using a time filter to view only the losses during the invasion of U.S. coastal waters period, we see a wide, thin distribution of U-boat sinkings. Looking at these collectively in the histogram, we see that 24 U-boats were sunk, the majority by surface vessels. During the all-out offensive loss of refuelers phases, we see higher density of sinkings distributed along the main convoy routes and off the Bay of Biscay. Looking at all sunk during this period, we see a major increase in the number of U-boats sunk, and we see a change to a large majority being sunk by a shore-based aircraft. We also see that communications intelligence started to play a role. Next, we narrow the time window and look sequentially at the instability that occurred after the May 1943 tipping point. The locus of U-boat sinkings jumps randomly around the Atlantic. Using the same chart without the heat map, we see the number and locations of U-boats sunk due to all causes. We see that those directly attributed to communications or ultra-intercepts totaled only about 10%. Ultra-intercepts that were being read starting in 1943 did play a large role, but the biggest contribution from ultra was actually the rerouting of convoys around Wolfpack lines, unlike the one convoy ONS-5 was unfortunately unable to avoid. Notice that equal numbers of U-boats were ultimately sunk solely by surface vessels and solely by shore-based aircraft. Conventional wisdom holds that once very long-range aircraft came into the picture in sufficiently large numbers to close the mid-Atlantic air gap, the U-boat sinkings increased greatly. The facts are a bit more subtle. We'll select those sunk by shore-based aircraft, then invert the selection to delete all not sunk by shore-based aircraft. Both the geospatial and temporal distribution still shows those sunk by aircraft hugging coastlines. We can see that the peak number of U-boat sinkings occurred in June-July 1943, after Dönitz pulled the U-boats back from the main convoy routes. The next peak occurred in May-June 1944 in the run-up to the Normandy invasion. Notice the location of those sinkings. Shore-based aircraft did not work alone, of course, so we'll look at all of the sinkings attributed to any aircraft involvement by repeating the same steps for isolating only the events involving ship and shore-based aircraft. The pattern peaks in mid-1943, but expanding the timeline for finer granularity shows a peak in July, again after the U-boats were withdrawn from the main convoy routes. Finally, let's look at just the Bay of Biscay, an area of concentrated focus by Coastal Command. We'll first search for all the events that occurred in this area. Not all of the events found are U-boat losses, so we'll clear everything except the U-boat losses. We see 48 U-boats were sunk, 29 by shore-based aircraft, 6 by mines, 4 by shore and ship-based aircraft, 4 by surface ships, 3 by operational accidents, and 2 by submarines. Please contact us if you have any questions about the demonstration or Envisioning History. Queries about participation in development of the Envisioning History project can be made by emailing the address indicated.